Hey guys, tonight we are drifting into the humid, moonlit stillness of ancient Cambodia, where the water is so flat it looks like a mirror for the gods, and the only thing louder than your thoughts is the rhythmic pulse of cicadas in the distance. We are heading back to a time when the city of Angkor wasn't a collection of vine-choked ruins, but a sprawling, liquid metropolis that glittered under the tropical sun. Imagine you're sitting in a shallow, wooden boat, the kind that feels just a little too narrow for comfort, gliding across a body of water so massive you can't see the other side in the dark. It's peaceful, sure, but let's be real. If you were actually there in the 12th century, you'd probably be dealing with a mild case of dysentery or a very territorial crocodile. You probably won't survive this journey if we were doing it for real, but since you're tucked under your duvet, you're perfectly safe. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and the local time in the comments so I can imagine where in the world you're falling asleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The water beneath your boat is the West Baray, and calling it a pond would be like calling the sun a nightlight. You lean over the edge, trailing your fingers through the lukewarm water, feeling the slight drag against your skin. This isn't a natural lake. Every single drop of water around you, millions upon millions of gallons, is held in place by human hands and sheer, stubborn will. In the moonlight, the surface is an obsidian sheet, occasionally broken by the soft bloop of a fish or the ripple of your own paddle. You're floating on a reservoir that is roughly 5 miles long and over a mile wide. To put that in perspective for your sleepy brain, you could fit about 10 Central Parks inside this thing and still have room for a few extra palaces. The air is heavy, smelling of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and the faint, smoky scent of cooking fires drifting from the embankments. You look toward the shore, or what you assume is the shore, but it's just a dark, straight line on the horizon. That's the first thing that strikes you about Angkor's water. It's terrifyingly perfect geometry. Nature doesn't like straight lines, but the Khmer engineers absolutely love them. They didn't just dig a hole. They built massive earthen dikes to pen the water in, raising the level of the lake above the surrounding plains. You're essentially floating in a giant, elevated bathtub that kept an entire civilization from losing its mind during the dry season. It's about 1050 AD, and the city around you is the most populous place on Earth, yet it feels strangely quiet tonight. Maybe everyone else has the right idea and is already asleep. You adjust your position in the boat, trying to find a spot that doesn't poke you in the ribs. It's funny, isn't it? We think of boring history as just dates and dust, but for the person paddling this boat 1,000 years ago, the most boring thing in the world was this water. It was just there. It was the background noise of their life. But that boring water is exactly why the temple survived, why the kings stayed powerful, and why you aren't currently staring at a desert. One mainstream historical fact you might find interesting while you drift is that the West Baray was largely constructed during the reign of King Suryavarman I and finished under Yavarman II. It remains the largest hand-dug reservoir in the world. Imagine the HR nightmare of organizing that many people with shovels. You need a lot of coffee, and unfortunately for the workers, caffeine wouldn't arrive in this part of the world for quite some time. They did it all with basic tools, elephants, and probably a lot of pointing and shouting. As you paddle deeper into the center of the Baray, the silence grows. You start thinking about a quirky tidbit I heard once. A bit of fringe lore that suggests the water in these Barays wasn't just for drinking or farming. Some believe it was actually treated as a giant, liquid battery for spiritual energy. There's this idea that the water was charged by passing over thousands of sacred lingas, stone carvings of Shiva's symbol, carved directly into the riverbeds in the mountains upstream. So, as you trail your hand in the water, you aren't just touching H2O, you're touching holy water that's been through a divine car wash before it even reached the city. It's a nice thought, though I suspect the people doing their laundry in it had a more practical view of things. The boat lets out a long, low creak echoing across the water. You find yourself wondering why they went to all this trouble. Historians still argue whether these massive reservoirs were actually functional irrigation systems designed to feed 1 million people, or if they were primarily grand architectural displays of power meant to mirror the Hindu cosmos. Some scholars think the Barays were mostly for show, a way for a king to say, "Look, I have so much water, I can keep it in a giant box just for the vibes." Others point out that without this water, the rice fields would have turned to crackers during the 6-month drought that hits this region every year. It's the ultimate did they or didn't they of the archaeological world, and since the ancient Khmer didn't leave behind a plumbing for dummies manual, we're left to guess while we float here in the dark. You realize your arm is getting tired from the paddling, so you pull the wood in or into the boat and just let yourself drift. The stars above are impossibly bright, reflected so clearly in the still water that it feels like you're floating in the middle of a void, suspended between two heavens. It's a bit disorienting, honestly. You might feel a little dizzy, but that's probably just the lack of sleep and the humidity. It's so quiet that you can hear your own heartbeat. You think about the sheer scale of the engineering beneath your hull. To build this, they had to move 12 million cubic meters of earth. If you try to do that today with a plastic beach bucket, you'd be there until the next ice age, and you'd probably have a very bad sunburn. The city of Angkor was essentially a giant machine made of water and stone. The canals acted like veins, the Barays like hearts, and the rice fields like the stomach. And you're just a tiny speck on the surface of the biggest heart of them all. You watch a small firefly blink near the surface of the water, its tiny light doubling in the reflection. It's hypnotic. You find yourself leaning back against the side of the boat, staring up at the constellations. They look the same as they do now, mostly. Orion is still there, looking like he's trying to pick a fight with a bull. The stars don't care about reservoirs or kings or how tired you are. They just stay there, cold and constant, watching the water rise and fall over the centuries. You feel the boat turn slowly in a gentle, invisible current. Even in this still water, there is movement. Everything in Angkor is moving slowly toward the sea. The water comes from the Khmer Mountains, flows through the city, rests in the Barays, and eventually finds its way to the Tunnel Sap Lake. It's a cycle that has repeated for over 1,000 years. You close your eyes for a second, listening to the water lap against the wood. Slap, ripple, stillness. It's the most boring sound in the world, and right now, that is exactly what you need. You aren't worried about the irrigation debates or the bronze statues hidden in the depths. You're just a passenger on a dark mirror, waiting for the morning that's still hours away. The boat continues its slow, aimless spin, and as you look away from the vastness of the West Baray, you start to notice that this giant basin isn't an isolated lake. It's the motherboard of a massive, liquid computer. If you could somehow rise above the trees, floating up like a stray ember from a campfire, you'd see that the entire landscape is etched with a silver spiderweb of canals. Every temple, every cluster of thatched roof houses, and every royal palace is cradled by water. This isn't just a city with a few pretty fountains. This is a hydropolis, a place where the infrastructure is so complex it makes your local DMV's filing system look like a toddler's finger painting. You're looking at a grid so precise it would make a modern urban planner weep into their morning espresso. Imagine the sheer audacity of it. The Khmer didn't just build a city. They redesigned the earth to suit their needs. From your vantage point in the boat, you can see the entrances to the smaller distribution canals. These are the veins that carry the lifeblood of the empire out to the thirsty fields. They are perfectly straight, cutting through the heavy tropical greenery with a geometric stubbornness that's almost aggressive. It's as if the kings looked at the messy, chaotic jungle and said, "No, we're going to do rectangles today." And they did. They built hundreds of miles of these channels, some wide enough for 2 large barges to pass each other, others narrow enough that you could hop across them if you were feeling particularly athletic. Though, again, with the local crocodile population, you probably want to think twice about that. One mainstream historical fact that hits home when you see this grid is that at its height, Greater Angkor covered nearly 1,000 square kilometers. To put that in terms your sleepy brain can process, that's roughly the size of modern-day Los Angeles, but without the soul-crushing freeway traffic and the overpriced avocado toast. For the 11th and 12th centuries, this was an unthinkable scale. While most European cities were still just a collection of muddy huts huddled around a drafty stone tower, Angkor was a sprawling, high-tech water machine. The grid wasn't just for show, it was a highly functional survival strategy. The city was designed to capture every single drop of rain that fell during the monsoon and store it for the long, punishing months when the sky turned into a hot, empty bowl. As you drift near the edge of a canal, you might notice something odd about the way the water moves. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. The Khmer didn't just use these canals for drinking and farming. They were the city's primary heavy-lift freight system. Most of those massive, multi-ton sandstone blocks used to build the famous temples, they weren't dragged overland by thousands of exhausted people. Well, they were, but only for the short trips. For the long haul, the stones were loaded onto wooden rafts and floated down these canals from the quarries in the Kulin Mountains, some 30 miles away. It was basically the 12th century version of Amazon Prime, only instead of a cardboard box with a smiley face, you get a 5-ton block of gray rock that would eventually become a god's face. You have to appreciate the irony. The very water that kept the people alive was also the highway that brought the weight of the heavens down into the valley. The rhythm of the city's plumbing is almost musical if you listen closely. You can hear the distant, muffled sound of water spilling over a stone weir, a small dam designed to regulate the flow. It's a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrates through the hull of your boat. It's soothing, but it represents a staggering amount of math. The engineers had to calculate the exact slope of the land to ensure the water moved via gravity alone. There were no electric pumps, no diesel engines, just the gentle, relentless pull of the earth. If they got the angle wrong by even a fraction of a degree, the water would either stagnate and turn into a mosquito-breeding swamp or move too fast and wash away the dikes. It was a high-stakes game of don't break the city, and for several centuries, they were the world champions. However, even with all this precision, there's a lot we don't know. Historians still argue whether this massive grid was a master plan vision from the very beginning or if it was a series of desperate, patchwork, improvisations added by successive kings. Some scholars look at the symmetry and see a divine blueprint, a city of the gods laid out with cosmic intent. Others look at the way some canals cut awkwardly across older ones and see a giant, watery version of a software update gone wrong. They argue it was a chaotic, evolving system that eventually became so large and unwieldy that no one really knew how the whole thing worked anymore. It's the ancient equivalent of having so many cables behind your TV that you're afraid to unplug anything for fear the whole house might explode. You find yourself drifting toward a junction where two canals meet. The water here is a bit more turbulent, swirling in slow, lazy eddies. In the moonlight, you can see the remains of a small stone bridge. It's simple, functional, and yet incredibly elegant. You think about the people who lived along these banks. For them, the grid wasn't a marvel of engineering, it was just home. They'd wake up, wash their face in the canal, check the water level in their rice paddy, and maybe complain about the traffic of stone-carrying rafts blocking the way to the market. It's the mundane reality of living inside a masterpiece. You're floating through someone's backyard, someone's workplace, and someone's church all at once. The humidity is starting to settle on your skin like a damp silk sheet. You adjust your position again, resting your head on the wooden seat of the boat. The boringness of the grid starts to feel like a warm blanket. The straight lines, the predictable turns, the constant, steady flow. It's all so orderly. In a world that often feels like it's spinning out of control, there's something deeply comforting about a civilization that spent centuries perfecting the art of the right angle. They took the chaos of the monsoon and turned it into a library of liquid. You close your eyes and imagine the map in your head. The great north-south axis, the East Baray, the West Baray, the moat of Angkor, what? All of them connected, all of them breathing together. It's a giant stone and water lungs system, inhaling the rain and exhaling life. You don't need to understand the fluid dynamics or the architectural theories to feel the peace of it. The water doesn't care if it's part of a master plan or a patchwork improv. It just flows where it's told, following the path of least resistance, carrying the city through the night. And as you drift further down the canal, leaving the open water of the Baray behind, you let that same path of least resistance carry you toward a deeper, heavier sleep. The grid is holding you. The water is steady. You are exactly where you need to be. The boat continues its slow, rhythmic creak, and you find yourself thinking about the people who actually sat on the throne and looked out over this liquid empire. You have to imagine that being a king in Angkor was less about wearing a shiny crown and more about being the chief executive officer of the monsoon. Enter King Suryavarman. He's the man who really kicked this whole waterbending project into high gear. Before him, the city was impressive, sure, but it was Suryavarman who looked at the landscape and decided that nature was just a rough draft that needed a lot of editing. You can almost see him standing on a ridge, squinting through the humidity, pointing a bejeweled finger at a massive swamp and saying, "Make that a perfect rectangle, and do it by Tuesday." It's about the year 1002, and Suryavarman has just finished a rather messy civil war to take the throne. When you just spent 9 years fighting your way to the top, you probably want to build something that says, "I'm here to stay, and I'm much more organized than the last guy." A mainstream historical fact you should know while you're drifting is that Suryavarman wasn't just a builder. He was a massive consolidator of power who forced thousands of local officials to swear oaths of loyalty to him. He was the first to truly centralize the Khmer Empire, turning a collection of feuding territories into a unified machine fueled by rice and regulated by reservoirs. He understood that if you control the water, you control the people, the food, and the future. It's the ultimate power move, owning the very rain that falls from the sky. But let's talk about the man himself. There's something a bit funny about the royal ego. Most people, when they want to be remembered, write a diary or maybe plant a tree. Suryavarman decided to move enough dirt to bury a small mountain range just to hold a pond. You have to appreciate that level of commitment to a theme. I imagine his royal architects were constantly stressed out, probably walking around with rolls of palm leaf blueprints and a permanent headache. "Yes, Your Majesty, another 5-mile reservoir." "No, Your Majesty, we don't have power tools yet." "Yes, we'll get more elephants." It's the kind of high-pressure work environment that makes a modern corporate retreat look like a spa day. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief from the ghost of an ancient architect every time you paddle over a particularly straight section of the canal. As you drift closer to the edge of the West Baray, the moonlight catches a weathered stone inscription near an old sluice gate. This brings us to a bit of a quirky tidbit. Some fringe theories suggest that Suryavarman wasn't even originally from the local Khmer royalty, but was actually an outsider from the Malay Peninsula. There's this persistent idea that he brought foreign ideas about maritime trade and water management to the heart of the jungle. Imagine a guy showing up with a different accent and a very specific plan for how to build a giant bathtub. It's like an 11th century version of an international consultant coming in to disrupt the industry. Whether he was a local or a high-ranking expat, he certainly knew how to make a splash, literally. The water is so still now that you can see the reflection of a single, bright planet, maybe Jupiter, perfectly centered in a ripple. You think about the sheer audacity of reshaping the Earth like this. Historians still argue whether Suryavarman's obsession with these massive water projects was driven by a genuine need for better irrigation or if it was almost entirely a religious PR campaign. Some scholars believe the Barays were intended to be giant mirrors for the heavens, designed so that the gods looking down would see their own celestial oceans reflected perfectly on Earth. Others argue it was purely practical, that the king was simply a visionary who realized that 1 million people can't live on good vibes alone. They need rice, and rice needs a lot of puddles. It's the classic debate. Was he a mystic or a middle manager with a very large budget? You can almost feel the heat of the day radiating off the stones of the embankment, even now in the dead of night. It's a heavy, sleepy warmth. You imagine the king himself, probably draped in heavy silk and gold, sweating profusely under a royal parasol while he inspected the construction. Even with all the power in the world, he still had to deal with the same mosquitoes that are currently eyeing your ankles. There's a certain comfort in knowing that ancient royalty was just as annoyed by the humidity as we are. You can picture him swatting at a fly with a fan made of peacock feathers, try to look dignified while his royal perfume loses the battle against the scent of swamp mud and elephant dung. It's the glamorous life of a 11th century ruler. The boat bumps gently against a cluster of lotus flowers. They're closed up for the night, looking like pale, sleeping light bulbs bobbing on the surface. These flowers were sacred, often associated with the very water systems Suryavarman perfected. You think about the labor, the sheer, staggering human effort. Every bucket of dirt moved was a person's afternoon, their sweat, their sore back. And yet, there's no record of a great labor strike of 10-20. People just did it. They worked in the mud, following the king's geometry, creating something that would outlast their names by 1,000 years. It's a bit humbling, isn't it? We get annoyed if the Wi-Fi takes 10 seconds to reconnect, but these people spent decades digging a hole that was essentially a giant love letter to the rainy season. The boring history of it all is that it worked. For centuries, this system kept the city calm. While other empires were collapsing due to drought or famine, Angkor stayed green. Suryavarman's liquid computer kept humming along, calculating the exact amount of water needed to keep 1,000,000 bellies full. You lean back, the wood of the boat feeling solid and reliable beneath you. The king is long gone, his gold has been recycled, and his name is mostly found in textbooks that students use as pillows, but his water is still here. It's still flat, still heavy, and still holding the moonlight exactly the way he intended. You find yourself yawning, the sound swallowed by the vast, open space of the Baray. The story of the kings is just a series of names, but the water is a feeling. It's the feeling of stability. It's the feeling of a plan that actually came together. You don't need to remember the dates or the dynasties to appreciate the silence. Suryavarman wanted to build a legacy that would stand still, and as you drift into the middle of his masterpiece, you realize he succeeded. The world outside is moving and shaking and changing, but here, in the middle of a 1,000-year-old reservoir, everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. You close your eyes, letting the ghost of a royal command guide you into a deeper, much more organized sleep. As the boat drifts closer to the edge of the West Baray, you decide to step out onto the bank, your sandals sinking slightly into the soft, cool mud. You're standing at the base of a massive earthen wall, a dike that rises above you like a silent green mountain. This is where the real magic, or rather, the real math, happens. You look up at the slope, which is covered in thick grass and the occasional gnarled tree root, and you realize that you aren't actually at the shore of a lake. You're standing at the base of a giant, human-made container. Most people assume that to make a reservoir, you just dig a massive hole in the ground. But the Khmer engineers were much cleverer and perhaps a bit lazier in the best way possible. They didn't want to haul all that dirt away, so they used it to build walls, effectively trapping the water on top of the flat plains. You begin to walk along the base of the dike, the sound of your footsteps muffled by the damp earth. It's a strange sensation, knowing that millions of tons of water are hovering just a few dozen feet above your head, held back by nothing but carefully packed soil and the grace of the gods. If this were a modern construction site, there would be yellow tape, hard hats, and a guy with a clipboard telling you that you're violating at least 6 safety protocols. But here, in the 11th century, this was just state-of-the-art urban planning. You have to imagine the lead engineer standing here 1,000 years ago, probably wearing a simple linen wrap and holding a bamboo leveling stick, looking at this massive wall and thinking, yeah, that'll probably hold. It's the ultimate trust me, I'm an engineer moment, sans the fancy degree and the LinkedIn profile. A mainstream historical fact that still leaves modern surveyors scratching their heads is the incredible precision of the gradient used in these systems. The canals that fed into and out of these Barays often had a slope of only about 0.1%. That means for every kilometer the water traveled, it only dropped by a single meter. To achieve that kind of accuracy over dozens of miles without lasers, GPS, or even a decent spirit level is nothing short of a miracle. They likely used long troughs of water to check for levelness, a method that is as boring as it is brilliant. They were essentially playing a high-stakes game of don't let the water sit still, and they were winning. As you climb slowly toward the top of the embankment, you notice something odd glinting in the moonlight near a stone culvert. This is a quirky tidbit you won't find in most tourist brochures. To keep the stones of the water gates from shifting under the immense pressure of the Baray, the Khmer used iron staples. They would carve U-shaped channels into two adjacent stone blocks, fit a piece of iron across the gap, and then pour molten lead over it to seal it in place. It's like they were using giant, heavy metal Legos to build their plumbing. It's a bit hardcore for a water system, isn't it? While the rest of the world was struggling to keep their roofs from leaking, the Khmer were essentially welding their lakes together with iron and lead. You finally reach the top of the dike, and the view is breathtaking. On one side, the vast, dark mirror of the Baray stretches out to the horizon. On the other, the land drops away into the shadowed grid of the city, where the smaller canals carry the water away like silver threads. You realize that the entire city of Angkor is tilted, not in a leaning tower of Pisa kind of way, but in a very deliberate, functional way. The whole landscape was graded to allow gravity to do all the heavy lifting. There wasn't a single pump in the entire empire. No steam, no electricity, just the relentless, silent pull of the Earth's core. It's the most peaceful engine you can imagine, a machine that runs on gravity and never needs an oil change. However, the more you look at this vast system, the more you see the potential for disaster. Historians still argue whether this rigid engineering was actually a technological trap. Some scholars suggest that by building such a massive, interconnected system, the Khmer made themselves incredibly vulnerable. If one dike broke or one canal silted up, it could cause a literal butterfly effect of failure throughout the entire city. It's like having a house where if one light bulb burns out, the fridge explodes and the front door locks itself. You're standing on the edge of a masterpiece that might also have been a ticking time bomb of infrastructure. But for now, in the cool night air, it's just a solid, dependable wall of earth. You take a seat on a large sandstone block at the crest of the dike, letting your legs dangle over the side. The air up here is a little fresher, catching a faint breeze that smells like distant rain. You think about the boring reality of maintenance. This wasn't a set-it-and-forget-it situation. Thousands of people would have been assigned just to walk these dikes, looking for leaks, checking for erosion, and making sure that no cheeky water buffalo was trying to dig a hole through the empire's lifeline. It was a never-ending job. You can imagine a group of workers sitting exactly where you are now, complaining about their boss or the quality of a local rice wine, while they waited for their shift to end. The scale of it all is almost too much to process. To build just this one Baray, they had to move enough earth to fill about 5 million large dump trucks. Since they didn't have dump trucks, or even wheelbarrows, which hadn't quite made it to this part of the world yet, everything was moved in baskets carried on shoulders or by elephants. It's the kind of project that makes a weekend DIY look like a joke. You probably won't survive a single day of that kind of labor, but you can certainly appreciate the results from the comfort of your seat. The sheer human will to power required to look at a flat plane and say, "I think I'll put a C here," is both inspiring and a little bit terrifying. You lean back, resting your palms on the rough stone. The texture is grainy and cool. You can feel the vibration of the water somewhere deep inside the dike, a low, rhythmic thrum that's more felt than heard. It's the heartbeat of the city. As long as the water stays behind the wall, the city sleeps in peace. As long as the gravity keeps pulling, the rice keeps growing. It's a simple contract between the people and the planet, written in mud and iron staples. You find your own breathing starting to sync up with that low vibration. In out, in out. The engineering is complex, but the feeling is simple. You are safe, you're high above the flood, and the world is working exactly the way it was designed to. The stars above the Baray, seem to have shifted just a fraction. Time is moving, but here on the dike, it feels like it's standing still. You don't need to be an engineer to appreciate the stability of a well-built wall. You don't need to understand the math to feel the comfort of a system that just works. You close your eyes, the gentle breeze ruffling your hair, and let the boring perfection of 11th century physics carry you a little closer to the edge of sleep. The dikes are holding. The water is where it belongs. And you are perfectly, wonderfully still. You step back into your boat, the wood groaning softly as it takes your weight, and push off from the massive earthen dike. As you glide back toward the center of the West Baray, the water feels different than it did before. It no longer feels like just a utility or a giant bathtub for a thirsty city. In the deep, velvet purple of the midnight hour, the water starts to feel heavy with meaning. You realize that for the people who lived here, this wasn't just a reservoir. It was a physical map of the universe. In Hindu cosmology, the center of the world is Mount Meru, a golden mountain that reaches into the heavens, and it is surrounded by vast, eternal oceans. When you look at the silhouette of the temples in the distance, their stone towers rising like jagged teeth against the stars, you aren't just looking at buildings. You're looking at mountains. And the water you're floating on? This is the cosmic ocean. It's a bit of a mind-bender, isn't it? Imagine being so committed to your religious aesthetic that you don't just build a church. You rebuild the entire geography of your kingdom to prove a point to the gods. It's the ultimate vibe check for the afterlife. If a god were to look down from the clouds, they wouldn't see a messy human city. They would see a perfect, miniature version of their own celestial home. You have to wonder if the Khmer kings ever worried about the gods being a bit annoyed by the imitation, like showing up to a party wearing the exact same outfit as the host. Oh, you have an infinite ocean? That's cute. I have a 5-mile one held together by iron staples and elephant sweat. A mainstream historical fact that grounds this cosmic poetry is that the layout of Angkor, including the Barays and the moats, was designed according to the principles of the Vasta Shastra, ancient Indian architectural treatises. These texts dictated that a city should be a mandala, a sacred diagram that represents the cosmos. Every canal, every dike, and every reservoir was positioned to align with the cardinal directions and the movements of the stars. The West Baray itself is a perfect rectangle aligned almost exactly on an east-west axis. They weren't just digging for water. They were drawing on the earth with a giant watery ruler, making sure that everything was in its right place so the universe wouldn't accidentally tip over. As you drift, you might find yourself staring into the dark depths beneath your boat, wondering what's down there. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. Some of the more out-there theories suggest that the Barays weren't just symbolic oceans, but were designed to be giant spirit mirrors. There's a fringe idea that the water had to be kept perfectly still, hence the massive dikes blocking the wind, so that the reflection of the temples would create a shadow city beneath the surface. This subterranean Angkor was thought to be where the spirits of the ancestors lived. So, as you paddle along, you're technically floating over a ghost metropolis. It's a cool thought, though if I were a ghost, I think I prefer a nice dry palace over a soggy basement, no matter how holy the water is. The silence on the Baray is so thick you could almost cut it with your paddle. You think about the Devaraja, or the God King. The ruler of Angkor wasn't just a guy with a crown. He was a living bridge between the human world and the divine. By building these Barays, the king was literally managing the cosmic oceans. It's a lot of pressure for one person. Imagine the stress of a drought. It wouldn't just be a political failure. It would be a spiritual crisis. If the Baray went dry, it meant the cosmic ocean was leaking, and that's a hard thing to explain to your constituents. Sorry, guys. The universe is currently out of order. Please check back after the monsoon. You probably won't survive the ensuing peasant revolt if that happened on your watch. However, the intersection of religion and plumbing is where things get really interesting for the experts. Historians still argue whether the religious symbolism of the Barays was the primary reason for their existence, or if the symbolism was just a holy coat of paint applied to a very practical irrigation project. Some scholars, the functionalists, argue that the Khmer were master engineers who built the reservoirs to grow rice, and then told the priests to make up a story about Mount Meru so the taxpayers wouldn't complain about the manual labor. On the other side, the symbolists believed that the religious map came first, and any rice grown from the water was just a happy, accidental side effect. It's the ancient version of the chicken or the egg debate, only with more sandstone and fewer chickens. You lean over the side of the boat, splashing a bit of water onto your face to stay awake. It's cool and refreshing, but you can't help but think about how much meaning is dissolved in every drop. For a farmer 1,000 years ago, this water was a gift from the king, who got it from the gods, who probably got it from the mountains. It was a chain of command that ended in a bowl of rice. There's something deeply peaceful about that level of certainty. You don't have to worry about the why when the what is so clearly laid out in front of you. The water is there, the temple is there, and the stars are exactly where the architect said they would be. The boat passes over a patch of submerged weeds that brush against the hull with a soft, shushing sound. It sounds like the earth is whispering hush to the water. You find yourself yawning again, your head feeling a bit heavy. The idea of the Baray as a cosmic ocean is starting to make a lot of sense. You're not just a person in a boat. You're a tiny speck in a vast, liquid mandala. The boring repetition of the waves, the boring symmetry of the dikes, it all adds up to a sense of profound order. In the 11th century, the world was a terrifying, unpredictable place, full of tigers and fevers and sudden storms. But here, inside the grid, everything was controlled. The kings had tamed the ocean and put it in a box. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the boat drift. You imagine the bronze statues that once stood at the center of these waters, symbols of Vishnu reclining on the cosmic serpent. They were meant to represent the god, dreaming the world into existence. As you float here, you start to feel like you're part of that dream. The water is the bed, the stars are the blanket, and the distant hum of the jungle is the lullaby. You don't need to decide if the Baray is a farm tool or a temple. Tonight, it's just a place to be still. It's a place where the gods and the engineers finally stopped arguing and just let the water reflect the sky. The current, if there is one, is so slight it's almost imaginary. You're suspended in the middle of a sacred ocean, miles away from the worries of the modern world. No emails, no traffic, no news cycles. Just you, a wooden boat, and 1,000 years of liquid history. The gods of Mount Meru probably had a lot on their plates, but you have to think that even they would have appreciated a quiet night like this. You let your hand dangle in the water one last time, feeling the spirit mirror ripple beneath your touch, and prepare yourself for the next leg of the journey through this watery heaven. You find yourself drifting away from the spiritual center of the Baray, moving back toward the periphery where the grand cosmic ocean meets the very real, very hungry mouths of the Khmer Empire. It is one thing to represent the heavens in stone and water, but it is quite another to make sure 1 million people have something to eat for breakfast. As you paddle toward the southern edge, the air begins to change. The scent of blooming jasmine is replaced by the smell of wet earth and ripening grain. In the moonlight, the landscape reveals itself not as a temple floor, but as a vast, shimmering patchwork of rice paddies. This was the true power of the water Barays. They were the engines of a triple crop system. While the rest of the world was often stuck with one measly harvest a year, and praying to whatever deity was available that a drought wouldn't kill that, the people of Angkor were basically running a 24/7 rice factory. Imagine the sheer logistical brilliance of it. Most of Southeast Asia is at the mercy of the monsoon. 6 months of, I forgot what the sun looks like, followed by 6 months of the ground is literally cracking open. But in Angkor, the Barays acted like a massive atmospheric save button. They captured the overflow of the rainy season and let it out in a controlled, steady trickle during the dry months. This allowed farmers to plant and harvest 2, sometimes 3 times a year. It turned the region into the breadbasket, or rather, the rice basket, of Asia. You're looking at a civilization that defeated the seasons. You probably won't survive a week of back-breaking labor in a muddy paddy, but you have to admire the people who turned a swamp into a gold mine of grain. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this prosperity is that at its peak, the Angkorian Empire was likely the most densely populated spot on the planet. Estimates suggest that the Greater Angkor region supported between 750,000 and 1 million people. To feed a population that size, you need an unfathomable amount of rice. Each person would have required roughly 200 kilograms of rice a year. If you do the math, and I know, it's late, don't hurt yourself. That's a mountain of rice every single season. The water in the Barays wasn't just holy. It was the literal currency of survival. If the water didn't flow, the empire didn't eat. It was the original too-big-to-fail economy, built on a foundation of mud and gravity. As you glide past a small wooden pier, you might notice the remains of ancient fishing gear, baskets and traps that haven't changed much in a millennium. This brings us to a quirky tidbit. The Barays weren't just for irrigation. They were also massive accidental protein farms. The still, warm waters of the reservoirs and the connecting canals were teeming with fish, particularly the walking catfish and the giant gourmet. Historians have found evidence that the Khmer diet was incredibly balanced for the time, largely because they lived inside a giant aquarium. They didn't just have rice. They had prahak, a pungent fermented fish paste that is still a staple in Cambodia today. It's the kind of smell that would probably wake you up from the deepest sleep, but back then, it was the smell of wealth. The sound of the water changes here, becoming a series of small, musical splashes as it moves from the main canal into a series of smaller lateral ditches. You can hear the heartbeat of the agriculture, the rhythmic opening and closing of wooden sluice gates. It's a very manual, very boring process of checking levels and moving mud. You imagine a farmer standing in the dark right now, his sarong tucked up, using his feet to bank up a small wall of earth to direct the flow. It's a quiet, lonely job, but it's the reason the great king can sit on a golden throne. Every grain of rice is a tiny miracle of water management. Despite the apparent perfection of the system, historians still argue whether the Khmer were actually over-farming the land. Some scholars suggest that the triple crop system, while brilliant, led to a slow-motion environmental disaster. By forcing the land to produce so much, they might have been stripping the soil of its nutrients faster than the monsoon silt could replace them. It's the ancient version of soil exhaustion, like trying to run a marathon every single day without ever eating a banana. Was the collapse of Angkor due to an external enemy? Or did they simply run out of dirt juice? It's a debate that keeps archaeologists up at night, though hopefully it won't keep you up. You lean back in the boat, watching a group of water buffaloes resting on the bank. They look like large gray boulders in the moonlight. They're slow, heavy breathing, a perfect soundtrack for a sleepy night. These animals were the tractors of the ancient world, and they were just as dependent on the Barays as the humans. In the dry season, the canals provided the wallowing holes they needed to stay cool. Everything in this city, the king, the priest, the farmer, the buffalo, the fish was part of a single, interlocking web of water. It's incredibly tidy when you think about it. It's a closed loop of energy and life, all centered around a giant rectangle of boring blue-gray water. The moonlight reflects off the young rice shoots, making the fields look like they've been dusted with silver. It's a beautiful sight, but it represents a staggering amount of discipline. You can't just let the water go wherever it wants. You have to be precise. If one farmer takes too much, the neighbor's crop dies. This led to a complex system of local water sharing and community laws. You weren't just a farmer. You were a member of a water collective. It's probably the most organized anyone has ever been about mud. You find yourself feeling a strange sense of respect for that level of cooperation. In a world of kings and wars, the most important thing was still just making sure the guy next door had enough water for his seedlings. As the boat moves further into the agricultural zone, the silence of the deep Baray is replaced by the soft, ambient, white noise of the countryside. There's the distant croak of a bullfrog, the rustle of wind through the tall rice stalks, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping for a moth. It's a very domestic, very safe kind of noise. It's the sound of a million bellies being full. You feel a sense of profound contentment drifting through this landscape. The boring history of Angkor isn't just about the collapse. It's about the centuries where things actually went right. It's about the long, quiet afternoons where the water flowed exactly where it was supposed to. You close your eyes and let the boat carry you. You don't need to see the fields to know they are there. You can smell them, the scent of green life and wet earth. You are floating through the most successful experiment in human history, a place where for 500 years, man and nature made a deal to keep the peace. The Baray provided the water, the people provided the labor, and the gods provided the rain. As you drift, you realize that the real calm of Angkor wasn't just in the stillness of the reservoir, but in the security of the next meal. And with that thought, your own mind starts to settle into a deep, nourished quiet, ready for whatever comes next in the flow of the night. The boat drifts toward the massive shadow of a construction site that has been silent for centuries, but in your mind's eye, the air is thick with the dust of 1,000 years ago. You've moved from the finished calm of the Baray to the raw, visceral memory of its creation. To build the West Baray, the Khmer didn't just need a plan and a king. They needed a literal army of laborers. You step out of the boat once more, this time onto a section of the bank that feels particularly steep. This is where the earth was torn open. We often look at these reservoirs and see a peaceful lake, but every cubic inch of this space was once solid ground that had to be relocated. It was a war against the landscape, fought with nothing but human muscle and the slow, heavy power of the elephant. Imagine the scene at the height of construction. It's not a quiet, meditative space. It's a cacophony of shouting, the rhythmic thud of wooden mallets, and the trumpeting of exhausted pachyderms. You probably won't survive an hour in this sun, let alone a 12-hour shift hauling a wicker basket filled with 50 pounds of heavy, clay-rich soil. There were no excavators, no backhoes, not even a simple pulley system for much of the work. It was mass manpower in its purest form. Thousands of people, their skins slick with sweat and coated in a fine layer of red dust, moving in a continuous, ant-like line from the center of the basin to the top of the growing dikes. It's the kind of boring labor that builds empires, one sore shoulder at a time. A mainstream historical fact that puts this into perspective is that the Khmer used a corvée labor system. This meant that every able-bodied citizen owed the state a certain amount of manual labor each year, usually during the dry season when the rice fields didn't need tending. It was essentially a labor tax. You didn't pay in gold, you paid in sweat. This allowed the kings to mobilize a workforce that would be impossible to pay in a modern economy. It's estimated that at any given time, tens of thousands of people were working on the water systems. While you're tucked in bed, just consider that the bed these workers returned to was often a simple bamboo mat on the dirt, provided they weren't too tired to even find it. As you walk along the ridge, you notice the deep, weathered grooves in some of the foundation stones. This brings us to a quirky tidbit about the heavy machinery of the 11th century, the elephants. These weren't just royal pets. They were the bulldozers of Angkor. To move the massive sandstone blocks for the sluice gates, elephants were outfitted with complex harnesses made of braided vines and leather. But here's the fringe bit. Some accounts suggest the Khmer used a specific mud lubricant technique. They would intentionally flood small sections of the work path to create a slick, slurry-like surface, making it easier for the elephants to slide the heavy sleds across the ground. It was basically a giant, muddy slip-and-slide for multi-ton rocks. It sounds fun until you realize you're the one who has to clean up the elephant afterward. The scale of the dig is hard to wrap your head around. Historians still argue whether the laborers were mostly voluntary citizens fulfilling their religious duty, or if a significant portion of the workforce was made up of prisoners of war and slaves. Some scholars point to inscriptions that suggest a sense of national pride and religious merit earning, where digging a reservoir was seen as a way to ensure a better reincarnation. Others, looking at the sheer brutality of moving 12 million cubic meters of earth, argue that no amount of spiritual merit could convince that many people to work themselves to the bone without a little bit of coercion from the royal guard. It's the dark side of the calm city, the realization that peace is often built on the backs of the exhausted. You find a spot to sit where the dike meets a stone retaining wall. The sandstone feels warm, holding the heat of a sun that set hours ago. You think about the boring repetitiveness of it all. Dig a basket of dirt. Walk up the hill. Dump the basket. Walk down the hill. Repeat 10,000 times. It's a meditative, soul-crushing rhythm. Yet there's a strange beauty in the result. By organizing this chaos, the Khmer created a landscape that looks like it was born, not made. The dikes are so large they feel like natural hills. The Baray is so vast, it has its own microclimate. You're sitting on a monument to human persistence. The moon moves behind a thin veil of clouds, softening the light. In the dimness, the shadows of the trees look like the ghosts of those workers still standing in line. You can almost hear the ghostly creak of the baskets. It's a reminder that history isn't just about the great men whose names are carved in stone. It's about the nameless millions who actually did the lifting. The water in the Baray is a mirror, and if you look closely enough, you don't just see the stars. You see the reflection of a million vanished lives. They're the boring part of the story, the ones that didn't get a temple named after them. But without them, the king would just be a guy standing in a very large, very dry hole. You lean back, looking up at the sky. The clouds are moving quickly now, a sign that the upper atmosphere is restless, even if the water below is still. You feel a deep sense of gratitude for your own soft pillow and the fact that you don't have a quota of dirt to move tomorrow. The effort required to keep this city calm was anything but peaceful. It was a frantic, multi-generational struggle against gravity and the jungle. And yet, the result is this: a silent, silver reservoir that looks like it has been here since the dawn of time. The wind picks up just a little, whistling through the grass on the dike. It's a lonely sound, but it's also a lullaby. It tells the story of the work being finished. The shovels are put away, the elephants are sleeping in the forest, and the baskets have long since rotted into the soil. All that remains is the water and the silence. You find your eyes growing heavier, the sheer weight of the history you're sitting on pressing you down into a comfortable, leaden stillness. You don't need to move any earth tonight. You just need to let the weight of the past hold you steady as you drift closer to the edge of the world. The boring part of the night is finally here, the part where nothing happens, and that is exactly the point. The dikes are built, the water is stored, and the labor is done. You can close your eyes now, knowing that the foundation beneath you is solid, hand-packed by 1,000 ghosts who wanted nothing more than for this water to stay exactly where it is. You are the beneficiary of their exhaustion. Sleep well, knowing the walls are holding, the elephants are quiet, and the empire is at rest. You climb back into the boat, the wood feeling familiar now, like an old friend in the dark. As you push off from the construction scar banks, the scene shifts again. You're leaving the ghosts of the laborers behind and drifting into the bustling, everyday heart of the city's water life. Even at this hour, the edges of the canals aren't entirely empty. You see the flickers of small oil lamps in the stilt houses that line the waterways. In the 12th century, the canals were more than just plumbing. They were the city's streets, its marketplaces, and its front porches. You're floating through a world where your neighbor isn't across the street, but across the water. It's a liquid neighborhood, and the boring reality of life here was one of constant, soggy motion. Imagine waking up, and the first thing you do is step down your wooden ladder directly into the canal to wash your face. No running water, no porcelain sinks, just the same water that's currently carrying your boat. You probably won't survive the sheer amount of bacteria we'd find in there today. But for the people of Angkor, this was the definition of convenience. The canals were the ultimate multi-tool. They provided the water for your morning tea, the route for your commute to the temple, and the place where you'd gossip with the merchant selling dried fish from a flat-bottomed skiff. It was a lifestyle that was completely fluid, literally and figuratively. You're drifting past the invisible boundaries of thousands of private lives, all of them tethered to the flow. A mainstream historical fact that makes this water city Even more impressive is that the Khmer developed a sophisticated system of floating or stilt architecture to handle the dramatic rise and fall of the water levels. During the monsoon, the canals could swell by several meters, and the Great Lake, the tunnel's sap, would actually reverse its flow and grow to 5 times its dry season size. The people of Angkor didn't fight the flood. They lived on top of it. Their houses were built on massive wooden pillars, some as tall as 2-story buildings today, allowing the water to pass harmlessly underneath. It was a city that breathed with the seasons, expanding and contracting like a giant wooden lung. As your boat passes under the dark silhouette of a wooden footbridge, you might hear the soft, rhythmic thump-thump of someone processing grain. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. The Khmer were pioneers in using water power for more than just irrigation. There is some evidence and much speculation that they used small, ingenious water wheels along the narrower canals to automate the husking of rice. While most of the world was still pounding grain by hand with heavy wooden poles, the clever folks in Angkor might have been letting the canal do the hard work for them. It's the 12th century equivalent of a life hack. Why break your back when the gravity of the Kilin Mountains can do it for you while you take a nap? The water here is busier, filled with the debris of a living city, stray lotus leaves, bits of carved wood, and the occasional lost sandal. Historians still argue whether the sanitation of such a massive, water-based city was a miracle of engineering or a public health nightmare waiting to happen. Some scholars believe the constant flow of water from the Barays acted as a natural flushing system, keeping the canals relatively clean and preventing the stagnant water diseases that plagued medieval Europe. Others are more skeptical, suggesting that with 1 million people living on top of their own water supply, the calm of the city might have been interrupted by frequent outbreaks of the great cringe-inducing stomachache. It's the ultimate historical glass half full or half-empty debate, except the glass is a canal and the water is slightly brown. You drift past a cluster of boats tied up for the night. They are loaded with goods, bales of silk, jars of fermented fish, and piles of yellow-orange turmeric. You can smell the spices even now. They cut through the damp, earthy scent of the canal with a sharp, pleasant kick. This was the market of the water. In the morning, this quiet stretch would be a chaotic, floating swap meet. Merchants would paddle their wares from house to house, and the boring task of grocery shopping involved a lot of skillful boat handling and haggling over the price of a duck. You imagine the sound of it, the clatter of wooden hulls bumping together, the shouts of the sellers, and the laughter of children jumping into the water to cool off. The boring history of the market is where the empire's true strength lay. It wasn't just about the gold in the king's palace. It was about the abundance of the everyday. Because of the Barays, there was always something to trade. There was always a surplus. This stability created a sense of calm that allowed art, religion, and culture to flourish. You don't build Angkor, what if you're worried about where your next meal is coming from? You only build for the gods when your belly is full and your boat is loaded with rice. As you float through the silent market zone, you're looking at the foundation of an entire civilization's peace of mind. You lean back, watching the stars through the gaps in the overhanging palm fronds. The movement of the boat is hypnotic, a gentle side-to-side sway that feels like being rocked in a cradle. You think about how different this is from our modern, paved-over lives. We live on solid ground, but these people lived on steady water. There's a difference. Ground is static, but water is a journey. Even when you're standing still in your house, the world is moving beneath you. It's a constant reminder that life is a flow, a cycle of rising and falling, of giving and taking. It's a very zen way to run a metropolis. The oil lamps in the stilt houses start to wink out one by one, leaving the canal in a deep, silvery shadow. The city is finally settling into its true sleep. You feel like an intruder in this private, watery world, but a welcome one. The water doesn't mind your presence. It just carries you along, indifferent to your thoughts or your destination. You find yourself yawning, the sound echoing softly off the wooden pillars of the houses. The boringness of the everyday, the washing, the trading, the cooking, is the most beautiful part of the story. It's the proof that the great machine worked. You let your paddle rest across your lap, the wood still warm from your hands. There's no need to steer. The canal knows where it's going. It leads to the next temple, the next field, the next generation. You close your eyes, listening to the soft slap-slap of the water against the stilts of the houses. It's a comforting, domestic sound. It's the sound of a million people being home, safe and dry above the dark, steady flow. You are part of the flow now, a single spark on a dark river, drifting toward the heart of the night. As you leave the quiet residential canals behind, the water begins to broaden, and the stone embankments grow taller and more ornate. You are approaching the heart of the capital, and the atmosphere shifts from the domestic to the monumental. You've entered the era of the empire's greatest waterbender, King Jayavarman VII. If Suryavarman, I was the one who started the grand plan, Jayavarman VII was the one who turned the volume up to 11. Ruling in the late 12th century, he didn't just maintain the water systems. He transformed the entire city into a massive stone and liquid prayer. You're floating toward the Bayon, his state temple, where hundreds of giant stone faces with enigmatic smiles look down at you. It's a bit unsettling. Honestly, imagine a 1,000-year-old stone giant watching you while you're trying to have a peaceful, sleepy moment. You probably won't survive the intense main character energy radiating from these ruins if you were there in person, but from your boat, it's just another layer of the calm. Jayavarman VII came to power after a period of absolute chaos. The city had been sacked by the Cham, and the water systems were in shambles. A mainstream historical fact you should know is that Jayavarman VII was the most prolific builder in Khmer history. He didn't just build for himself, he built for the public. He constructed over 100 hospitals and a vast network of rest houses along the roads, all of them connected by the life-giving flow of the canals. He viewed himself as a Mahayana Buddhist king, a healer of the people. Under his rule, the water wasn't just for rice and cosmic symbols anymore. It was for the relief of suffering. It was a giant hydraulic social safety net. But Jayavarman VII was also a man who loved a good project. While most people would be happy with a fresh coat of paint, he built the Neek Pian, a small temple in the middle of a reservoir that was designed to be a literal hospital. It consists of a central pond surrounded by 4 smaller ponds, representing the 4 great rivers of the world. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. The Neek Pian wasn't just a religious site, it was a spa for the soul. Pilgrims would come to bathe in the different ponds, believing the water was infused with medicinal properties. They'd go to the water of the lion for strength or the water of the horse for speed. It was basically a 12th century luxury wellness retreat, only with more chanting and fewer green smoothies. You have to admit, getting healed by a stone horse head is a much cooler story to tell your friends than, I went to a juice bar. The complexity of the plumbing under Jayavarman VII was staggering. Historians still argue whether his massive building spree actually bankrupted the empire's water management resources. Some scholars believe that by adding so many new canals and temples to an already overextended system, he pushed the infrastructure past its breaking point. They call it architectural hyperinflation. It's like trying to run the latest high-end video game on a laptop from 2005. Eventually, the fans are going to start screaming and the whole thing might just melt. Was Jayavarman a visionary healer, or was he a developer who didn't know when to stop? The debate is as deep as the Baray itself. You glide past a section of the city where the stone walls are carved with scenes of daily life. In the moonlight, you can see relief carvings of men fishing with nets, women cooking over small fires, and even a guy getting a tooth pulled. It's a boring documentary in stone. Jayavarman VII wanted the world to see that his city was alive, thriving, and, most importantly, wet. The water is everywhere in these carvings. It flows through the backgrounds of battle scenes and cradles the feet of the gods. It's the constant, silent protagonist of the Khmer story. You feel like you're paddling through a giant stone photo album. The boring history of Jayavarman's reign is that it was the empire's last great peak. He took a broken city and made it flow again. He understood that a king's primary job is to be the master of flow. If the water moves, the people move. If the water stays clean, the people stay healthy. It's a simple equation, but one that required a terrifying amount of oversight. You imagine his royal inspectors traveling the canals in swift, narrow boats, checking the dikes for leaks and the sluices for silt. It was a bureaucracy of the damp, a government that lived and died by the level of a wooden gauge in the mud. Oh, you lean your head back, the stone faces of the Bayon finally fading into the distance behind you. The air is cooler here, near the Great North Canal. You think about the calm that Jayavarman VII brought back to a city that had known only war. He used water as a sedative, a way to quiet the fears of a traumatized population. By building these vast, stable reservoirs, he was telling his subjects, the chaos is over. Look at how still the water is. Look at how certain the harvest will be. It's a powerful message. Even today, 1,000 years later, that stillness still has the power to pull you under. Not into the depths, but into a deep, heavy sleep. The boat passes a stone lion standing guard at a bridge. His face is worn smooth by centuries of monsoons, but he still looks alert, watching over the canal. You feel a sense of security being under the watch of Jayavarman's stone sentinels. The empire might have been complex, overextended, and obsessed with its own reflection, but it was also incredibly orderly. Everything had a place, and every place had its water. You find yourself sinking your breath with the slow, steady rhythm of the boat's wake. Rise and fall, rise and fall. You're drifting through the golden age of Angkor, a time when the boring stability of the water was at its absolute zenith. The hospitals are full of healing water, the temples are surrounded by cosmic oceans, and the rice fields are a sea of green. It's the perfect moment to close your eyes. You don't need to worry about the hyperinflation of the infrastructure or the wars to come. Right now, the Master of Flow has everything under control. The water is moving exactly as Jayavarman VII intended, and you are simply moving with it, floating toward the center of a very old, very peaceful dream. You continue to drift through the heart of the city, but the grand stone faces of the Bayon eventually recede, replaced by the vast, open horizon of the West Baray once more. This time, however, you aren't just hugging the banks. You're heading straight for the center. In the very middle of this 5-mile-long sea of man-made water, a small island begins to emerge from the darkness. This is the West Mebane, a temple that seems to float on the surface like a stone lotus flower. You paddle closer, the wooden hull of your boat occasionally brushing against submerged reeds. In the 11th century, this wasn't just a pile of rocks. It was the ultimate hidden sanctuary, a place where the king could escape the noise of the capital and sit in the middle of his own creation, surrounded by nothing but water and sky. The West Mebane is a strange, atmospheric place. It consists of a square stone platform with a series of small towers. But what makes it truly special is the mystery of what was once kept inside. A mainstream historical fact that adds a layer of awe to this island is that it originally housed a colossal bronze statue of the god Vishnu, reclining in a state of cosmic sleep on the back of the serpent Shisha. This wasn't just any statue. It was massive, with fragments found by archaeologists suggesting the entire figure was over 20 feet long. Imagine a giant, glowing bronze god resting in the middle of a giant lake, his closed eyes suggesting that the entire world, including you and your little boat, is just a figment of his divine imagination. It's a bit of an inception moment for the ancient world. If Vishnu wakes up, does the Baray vanish? Does your boat disappear? Best not to think about it too much while you're trying to fall asleep. As you tie your boat to a weathered stone ring on the island's edge, you step onto the sandstone blocks. They are cool and slippery with moss. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. The bronze Vishnu wasn't just a statue. It was part of a functional fountain. Some archaeological evidence suggests that water was piped through the statue's body, allowing it to spill out from his navel, symbolizing the birth of the universe. It's a very literal piece of spiritual plumbing. The Khmer didn't just want you to think about the creation of the world. They wanted you to see it happening in real time, powered by the very reservoir you're standing in. It's the ultimate 11th century interactive exhibit, though I imagine the maintenance on a bronze god fountain was a bit of a nightmare for the temple acolytes. The silence here on the island is different from the banks. It's a pressurized silence, weighed down by the millions of gallons of water pressing in from all sides. Historians still argue whether the West Mebane was actually built before the Baray was filled, or if the Khmer engineers had to build a massive cofferdam, a temporary dry space in the middle of the lake, to construct it. Some scholars think the island was a natural high point that they just paved over, while others believe the entire island is a man-made mountain of sand and stone hauled into the center of the reservoir before the sluice gates were first opened. It's a debate about the order of operations that makes your head spin. Did the lake come first, or the temple? It's a chicken and the egg scenario, but with much heavier building materials. You sit down on the edge of the temple platform, letting your feet dangle toward the water. You can see the reflection of the stars dancing in the ripples between your toes. In the dark, the bronze Vishnu is gone. His fragments are now tucked away in a museum in Phnom Penh, but his presence still lingers. You feel like a guest in a giant's bedroom. The boring history of this place is that it was a site of intense ritual. Priests would row out here daily to make offerings, their chanting lost in the vastness of the water. You imagine the sound of a single bronze bell ringing across the Baray, its tone carrying for miles in the still, humid air. It's a lonely, beautiful thought. The water of the Baray acts like a giant acoustic blanket, soaking up the sounds of the jungle and the city, leaving you with nothing but the sound of your own breathing. You think about the technical boredom of keeping this island dry. The engineers had to ensure that the temple didn't slowly sink into the soft silt of the reservoir floor. They used layers of heavy laterite and sand to create a stable foundation that has somehow survived for 1,000 years. It's a testament to the fact that when the Khmer built something, they intended it to stay put. They weren't interested in temporary structures or pop-up shops. They were building for eternity, or at least for as long as the rain kept falling. You lean back against a carved stone pillar, the surface rough with the patterns of celestial dancers. You probably won't survive the mainstay of the gods, if you were actually a mortal intruder back then, but tonight, the dancers seem to be welcoming you to rest. The calm of the Mebane is the calm of the absolute center. You are at the geometric heart of the empire's water system. Every canal radiates out from here. Every rice field is connected to this spot. You are sitting on the on-off switch of a civilization. It's a lot of power to be sitting on, but right now it just feels like a very sturdy, very quiet chair. The wind ripples the surface of the Baray, and for a second, the reflection of the moon shatters into 1,000 silver coins before slowly knitting itself back together. It's hypnotic. You find yourself watching the water mend itself over and over again. It's a reminder that no matter how much we disturb the surface of things, with our boats, our buildings, or our worries, the water eventually returns to its natural state of stillness. The boring persistence of the reservoir is its greatest gift. It's a giant, liquid reset button. You close your eyes, the scent of damp stone and ancient bronze, or the memory of it, filling your senses. The island feels like it's slowly drifting, though you know it's anchored deep in the earth. You're floating in the middle of a dream, guarded by a sleeping god and 1,000 years of engineering. You don't need to be a king or a priest to find the peace here. You just need to be still. The West Mebane is holding you, the Baray is surrounding you, and the bronze Vishnu is dreaming of a world where everything is exactly as it should be. You let yourself sink into that dream, your mind becoming as flat and silver as the water, ready to drift into the deep, quiet hours of the night. The boat pulls away from the silent stones of the West Mebane, and as you return to the open water, the atmosphere shifts from the mystical to the grit of reality. You start to notice that the water isn't quite as clear as it seemed in the center of the reservoir. Near the intake channels, the surface is cluttered with a fine, suspended layer of silt, the invisible enemy of every great civilization. While the kings were busy dreaming of cosmic oceans, and building bronze fountains, a much more boring and relentless battle was being fought beneath the surface. Every year, the monsoon rains didn't just bring water. They brought tons of mountain soil, sand, and organic debris washed down from the Killin Plateau. If left alone, this sediment would slowly fill the Barays, turning the mirrors of the gods into very expensive, very large mud puddles. Imagine the sheer, grinding monotony of the maintenance. You probably won't survive a single season as a member of the Silt Squad, but for the Khmer, dredging was a way of life. Thousands of people spent their days wading into the shallow edges of the canals with wooden scoops and baskets, fighting a war against dirt that they knew they could never truly win. It's the ultimate Sisyphus task of the ancient world. You dig out the mud today, and the next rainstorm brings twice as much back tomorrow. It was a constant, low-stakes crisis that required a level of bureaucratic organization that would make a modern city council's head spin. You're looking at a civilization that was essentially a giant, collective effort to keep a drain from clogging. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this struggle is that recent archaeological excavations have found massive spoil heaps along the edges of the major canals, long, artificial ridges made entirely of the silt dredged out over centuries. These weren't decorative. They were the waste of the empire. In some places, these piles are so large they've been mistaken for natural hills for hundreds of years. It's a literal mountain of boring work. While the temples were built of sandstone and faith, the infrastructure was maintained through sheer, repetitive drudgery. You have to wonder if there was an employee of the month for the guy who moved the most mud, or if the only reward was the fact that the city didn't turn into a swamp by August. As you drift past a particularly narrow section of the canal, you might notice something interesting about the way the banks are reinforced. This brings us to a quirky tidbit. The Khmer were pioneers in using biological engineering. To keep the banks of the canals from eroding into the water, they planted specific types of water-resistant grasses and trees whose deep, interlocking roots acted like a natural rebar. But the fringe theory is that they also used a type of sacred slime. Some researchers suggest that certain algae and mosses were encouraged to grow on the stone sluice gates because the slick, organic coating actually protected the sandstone from the abrasive power of the silt-heavy water. It's like they were using nature's own Teflon to keep the plumbing smooth. It's a bit gross when you think about it, but hey, if it keeps the reservoir from leaking, you don't complain about the moss. The battle against the sand was never-ending. Historians still argue whether the eventual decline of the water system was caused by a sudden catastrophe or simply by maintenance fatigue. Some scholars suggest that as the empire grew more complex and the kings more obsessed with grand monuments, they began to neglect the boring stuff. If you stop dredging for just a few years, the system starts to choke. It's the ancient version of infrastructure decay, like a city that spends all its money on a new stadium while the sewers are literally falling apart. Was Angkor's downfall caused by an invading army? Or was it just because someone forgot to hire enough people with buckets? It's a debate that makes the stillness of the water feel a lot more fragile. You watch the way the water swirls around your paddle, the sediment creating tiny, golden clouds in the moonlight. It's beautiful in a way, like liquid marble. But for the Khmer, those clouds were a threat. You think about the boring record-keeping that must have been involved. Every canal probably had a depth master, a person whose entire job was to stick a bamboo pole into the water and sigh heavily when it hit mud too soon. It's a very human image, a man in a loincloth, staring at a muddy stick, wondering if he has enough workers to clear the north gate before the heavy rains start. The humidity is thick enough to feel like a physical weight on your chest. You lean back, letting the boat's momentum carry you. The calm of the city was a manufactured product. It wasn't just there. It had to be defended every single day against the jungle's desire to reclaim the land. The jungle wants to grow. The silt wants to settle. The water wants to wander. The Khmer spent 500 years saying no to all three. You find yourself feeling a strange sort of empathy for those ancient plumbers. They kept the world steady so everyone else could dream. You close your eyes, the soft shush-shush of the water against the hull, sounding like the whisper of 1,000 brooms. The struggle against the silt is a reminder that even the most boring parts of history are often the most important. You don't need to be a hero to keep a city alive. Sometimes you just need to be a guy with a shovel and a lot of patience. As you drift into the deeper, quieter part of the canal, the thought of that patient, repetitive work starts to soothe your own restless mind. The world is full of things that need dredging, worries, tasks, half-finished thoughts. But for tonight, you can just let the silt settle. The boat moves into a stretch of water where the banks are high and the trees lean over to form a dark, leafy tunnel. It's cooler here, away from the open Baray. You listen to the sound of a distant, hidden stream trickling into the canal. It's a clean, sharp sound. The Silt Squad did their job well tonight. The water is moving, the path is clear, and the Empire is still breathing. You let your own breathing slow down to match the pace of the canal. There's no need to fight the flow or worry about the sediment. The boring work is done, the path is open, and the night is long. You are exactly where the gravity wants you to be, moving slowly toward the final, quietest part of the journey. The air tonight has grown strangely heavy, almost stagnant, and as your boat drifts away from the sheltered canals back toward the open expanse of the Baray, you feel a shift in the atmosphere. It's a tension you can't quite put your finger on, like the silence before a storm that never actually arrives. For centuries, the master of flow and his army of silt scoopers kept the city in a state of watery grace. But even the most brilliant engineers and the most powerful god kings are ultimately at the mercy of the sky. You're entering the late 14th century now, a time when the climate of Southeast Asia began to act like a broken radio, skipping and hissing and refusing to play the familiar tune of the monsoon. The calm of Angkor was about to be tested by a planetary shift that no iron staple or earthen dike could truly hold back. Imagine the mounting dread of a farmer standing on the bank where you were just sitting. In a normal year, the rains are like clockwork, predictable, reliable, and life-giving. But suddenly, the clock breaks. One year, the monsoon is a month late. The next year, it doesn't come at all. The ground, usually a lush sponge of life, turns into a parched, cracked mosaic of gray clay. You probably won't survive the psychological toll of watching your entire world's battery run out of juice. You're floating on the West Baray, but in this era, the water level is dropping. The vast obsidian mirror is shrinking, exposing muddy flats and the rotting remains of those biological engineering tree roots we admired earlier. It's the ultimate low battery warning for civilization. A mainstream historical fact that grounds this atmospheric dread is that during the 14th and 15th centuries, the region transitioned from the medieval climate anomaly to the Little Ice Age. This didn't just mean it got a bit cooler. It meant the monsoon patterns became violently erratic. Data shows that Angkor was hit by a series of mega-droughts that lasted for decades, followed by years of record-breaking, intense mega-floods. It was a climate whiplash that the rigid, geometric plumbing of the city simply wasn't designed to handle. The boring stability of the 11th century was replaced by a chaotic, unpredictable roller coaster of weather that would make even the most seasoned modern meteorologist want to change careers. As you look at the receding shoreline, you might notice the exposed roots of a massive, ancient cypress tree. This brings us to a quirky tidbit of modern science. We know exactly how bad these droughts were because of dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings. In the highlands of Vietnam and Cambodia, ancient trees like the Phocaena hodgentii act as tiny, wooden time capsules. By looking at the thickness of their rings, scientists discovered that the droughts during the decline of Angkor were some of the most severe in the last 1,000 years. One particular drought lasted for nearly 30 years. Imagine 3 decades of checking the sky and seeing nothing but a hot, empty blue. It's a level of boring tragedy that is hard to even comprehend. The water in your boat feels sluggish tonight. Historians still argue whether these climate shifts were the primary cause of Angkor's abandonment, or if they were just the final straw for a system already struggling with maintenance fatigue and political instability. Some scholars, the climate determinists, believed that no civilization on Earth could have survived such a brutal environmental shift. They argue that the Khmer were victims of a global event they couldn't control. Others, however, argue that the city's very rigidity was its downfall. Because the water system was so interconnected and so precise, it had no give. It couldn't adapt to the chaos. It was like a high-performance sports car trying to drive through a boulder field. Eventually, the suspension is just going to snap. You find yourself staring at the high-water mark on a stone bridge, a dark line several feet above the current surface. It's a haunting reminder of what used to be. You think about the boring despair of the king's accountants. How do you collect taxes and rice when there is no rice? How do you maintain the divine mirror when the gods have clearly turned their backs? The atmosphere of the city must have changed from one of monumental pride to one of quiet, desperate improvisation. You can imagine the priests rowing out to the West Mebane not to celebrate the cosmic birth, but to beg the bronze Vishnu to wake up and do something about the dust. The humidity is still there, but it feels different, less like a warm blanket and more like a heavy, airless weight. You lean back in the boat, watching the stars. They look indifferent as always. They don't care if the Baray is full or empty. This indifference is perhaps the most boring and terrifying part of history. Nature doesn't have a hero arc. It just does what it does, following the laws of thermodynamics and atmosphere pressure. You feel a sudden, sharp empathy for the people who had to live through the unmaking of their world. They did everything right. They dug the holes, they built the walls, they whispered the prayers, and the sky still refused to cooperate. Despite the drought, the Khmer didn't give up. They tried to adapt. They dug deeper wells. They narrowed the canals to increase the flow, and they built new, smaller dams. It was a frantic patchwork effort to keep the machine running. You can almost see the ghosts of the late-period engineers, their faces lined with worry, huddled over maps by the light of a flickering torch. They were trying to solve a 14th century problem with 11th century tools. It's the kind of high-stakes, boring work that never makes it into the epic poems, but it's the most human part of the story. You find your own mind drifting toward the idea of resilience. We often talk about empires falling, but maybe they just change. The people didn't vanish. They just moved. They followed the water. As the Barays grew stagnant and the canals filled with silt that no one had the energy to move, the center of gravity shifted away from the water machine and toward the rivers and the sea. You're floating on the end of an era. The calm of the city is now the calm of a long, slow exhale. The machine is winding down, the gears are grinding to a halt, and the water is finally being allowed to go back to being just water. The boat enters a patch of fog that has settled over the cooling reservoir. It's a soft, gray wall that swallows the stars and the shore. You are suspended in a void. There is no sound but the occasional, lonely drip of water from your paddle. Drip. Pause. Drip. It's the sound of a system losing its pressure. You feel a deep, heavy tiredness settle into your bones. Not the tiredness of labor, but the tiredness of letting go. The drought is a tragedy, yes, but it's also an end to the struggle. You don't have to fight the silt anymore. You don't have to hold back the cosmic ocean. You can just drift in the fog, waiting for the world to reshape itself into something new. The air tonight has grown strangely heavy, almost stagnant, and as your boat drifts away from the sheltered canals back toward the open expanse of the Baray, you feel a shift in the atmosphere. It's a tension you can't quite put your finger on, like the silence before a storm that never actually arrives. For centuries, the master of flow and his army of silt scoopers kept the city in a state of watery grace. But even the most brilliant engineers and the most powerful god kings are ultimately at the mercy of the sky. You're entering the late 14th century now, a time when the climate of Southeast Asia began to act like a broken radio, skipping and hissing and refusing to play the familiar tune of the monsoon. The calm of Angkor was about to be tested by a planetary shift that no iron staple or earthen dike could truly hold back. Imagine the mounting dread of a farmer standing on the bank where you were just sitting. In a normal year, the rains are like clockwork, predictable, reliable, and life-giving. But suddenly, the clock breaks. One year, the monsoon is a month late. The next year, it doesn't come at all. The ground, usually a lush sponge of life, turns into a parched, cracked mosaic of gray clay. You probably won't survive the psychological toll of watching your entire world's battery run out of juice. You're floating on the West Baray, but in this era, the water level is dropping. The vast obsidian mirror is shrinking, exposing muddy flats and the rotting remains of those biological engineering tree roots we admired earlier. It's the ultimate low battery warning for civilization. A mainstream historical fact that grounds this atmospheric dread is that during the 14th and 15th centuries, the region transitioned from the medieval climate anomaly to the Little Ice Age. This didn't just mean it got a bit cooler. It meant the monsoon patterns became violently erratic. Data shows that Angkor was hit by a series of mega-droughts that lasted for decades, followed by years of record-breaking, intense mega-floods. It was a climate whiplash that the rigid, geometric plumbing of the city simply wasn't designed to handle. The boring stability of the 11th century was replaced by a chaotic, unpredictable roller coaster of weather that would make even the most seasoned modern meteorologist want to change careers. As you look at the receding shoreline, you might notice the exposed roots of a massive, ancient cypress tree. This brings us to a quirky tidbit of modern science. We know exactly how bad these droughts were because of dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings. In the highlands of Vietnam and Cambodia, ancient trees like the Phocinia hodgentii act as tiny, wooden time capsules. By looking at the thickness of their rings, scientists discovered that the droughts during the decline of Angkor were some of the most severe in the last 1,000 years. One particular drought lasted for nearly 30 years. Imagine 3 decades of checking the sky and seeing nothing but a hot, empty blue. It's a level of boring tragedy that is hard to even comprehend. The scale of the collapse is a topic of intense, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the death of the city was a sudden, dramatic event or a long, agonizing whimper that lasted 100 years. Some scholars point to the year 1431, the traditionally accepted date for the sack of Angkor by the Ayutthaya kingdom, as the definitive end. They argue that the invasion was the killing blow. However, a growing number of environmental historians argue that the city was already a ghost of itself long before the first enemy soldier arrived at the gates. They believe the water system had already failed, leaving the population hungry, scattered, and unable to defend their stone and water dream. The war wasn't the cause. It was just the final, messy cleanup of a civilization that had already lost its flow. You rest your paddle and let the boat drift into a stagnant eddy near a collapsed sluice gate. The water here is dark and smells of rot. Not the healthy rot of a jungle, but the sour smell of a system that has stopped moving. The boring reality of a failed city is the silence. No one is dredging the silt. No one is adjusting the wooden gates. The buffaloes have wandered off into the forest, and the stilt houses are slowly being reclaimed by the vines. You think about the maintenance fatigue we mentioned earlier. At some point, the people just got tired. They looked at the broken walls and the dry fields and decided that the calm of the old ways was no longer worth the effort. They moved south toward the rivers that didn't require 1 million people to keep them in place. The humidity feels thinner now, or perhaps you've just become accustomed to it. You lean back against the wooden seat, staring up at the moon through the skeletal branches of a dead tree. The boringness of the collapse is that it wasn't a movie-style explosion. It was just a slow transition from order to chaos. It was the sound of 1,000 small leaks that no one bothered to plug. It's a humbling thought for anyone living in a modern city. We think our infrastructure is permanent, but it's actually a living thing that needs constant attention. Without the Silt Squad and the Master of Flow, even the greatest city on Earth is just a collection of rocks waiting to be buried by the sand. You find your eyes growing heavy as you consider the ghost city around you. The water is still there, but it's no longer a grid. It's a series of disconnected puddles and wild streams. The cosmic ocean has returned to being just a swamp. But there is a strange peace in this failure. The pressure is gone. The God King is no longer demanding your labor, and the priests are no longer asking you to mirror the heavens. You are just a person in a boat, in a place where nature is finally winning the argument. The boring struggle is over. The boat drifts into a patch of tall, feathery grass that has grown up through the cracked bed of a former canal. It's a soft, shushing sound that feels like a long-awaited good night. You realize that the calm of Angkor didn't vanish. It just changed its shape. It moved from the rigid, human-made stillness of the reservoir to the wild, natural stillness of the encroaching jungle. You don't need to fix the dikes tonight. You don't need to worry about the mega floods or the silt. The water will do what it wants, and for the first time in 500 years, that's perfectly okay. You close your eyes, letting the boat settle into the soft mud of the overgrown bank. You are tucked away in a corner of a lost empire, safe in the knowledge that even the most complex systems eventually find their way back to a simple, quiet rest. The city has exhaled. The gears have stopped, and you, drifting in the shadow of a broken masterpiece, are finally free to let the current of sleep carry you away into the dark. The boat feels lighter now, as if the weight of the ancient world has lifted, and as you drift into a clearing where the jungle canopy opens up to the sky, you aren't looking at the past through squinted eyes anymore. You're seeing it through the lens of a laser. This is the 21st century chapter of our journey, where the boring silence of the ruins is interrupted by the hum of a helicopter flying overhead. We've moved from the era of the master of flow to the era of LiDAR, light detection and ranging. For centuries, we thought we knew the scale of Angkor, but we were only looking at the scabs, the stone temples that refused to rot. We were missing the skin and the veins. You probably won't survive the staggering scale of what we've recently discovered. It turns out the water machine was even more massive than our wildest, sleep-deprived dreams. Imagine a scientist sitting in an air-conditioned lab, miles away from the mosquitoes and the humidity, looking at a computer screen. By firing billions of laser pulses from an aircraft down through the thick Cambodian jungle, they've been able to digitally deforest the landscape. What appeared to be just a tangled mess of trees to the naked eye suddenly revealed a hidden, geometric ghost world. You're floating over what the lasers saw, an endless, perfectly straight grid of mounds, ponds, and canals that stretch for miles beyond the temple walls. It's like someone turned on the lights in a dark room and realized the room was actually a stadium. The city wasn't just near the water. The city was the water. A mainstream historical fact that changed everything is that the 2012 and 2015 LiDAR surveys proved Angkor was the most extensive urban complex in the pre-industrial world. We used to think the population was centered around the stone monuments, but the lasers revealed that the entire 1,000 square kilometer region was a low-density forest city. Every single house had its own small pond, and every pond was connected to the larger Barays. It was a massive, decentralized network of liquid backyards. You aren't just in a boat in a reservoir. You're in the middle of a prehistoric version of suburban sprawl, where every driveway was a waterway and every lawn was a rice paddy. It makes our modern suburbs look incredibly uninspired and, frankly, a bit dry. As you drift, you might see a group of modern archaeologists working near the base of a newly discovered embankment. This leads us to a quirky tidbit of high-tech detective work. Researchers have started using pollen analysis taken from the bottom of these hidden ponds to reconstruct the ancient shopping list of the Khmer. By looking at microscopic grains of pollen trapped in the silt for 1,000 years, they found that the boring domestic gardens of Angkor were filled with lotus, cucumbers, and even decorative flowers. So, the water machine wasn't just for survival, it was for aesthetics. They wanted their liquid city to smell good and look pretty. It's comforting to know that even 1,000 years ago, people were obsessed with their curb appeal, even if their curb was a muddy canal bank. The clarity of the LiDAR data has settled one debate, but started a dozen others. Historians still argue whether this newly revealed hypercomplexity was a sign of the empire's absolute peak or the beginning of its fragility. Some scholars look at the laser maps and see a Goldilocks civilization. Everything was perfectly balanced for a specific set of conditions. But others see a Jenga tower of infrastructure. The lasers showed us just how many thousands of miles of canals had to be maintained. If even a small section of that network failed, the boring domino effect would be unstoppable. Was the city's vastness its greatest achievement, or was it just a very large target for the changing climate to hit? We are still staring at the computer screens, trying to find the answer in the patterns of light. You lean over the side of the boat, looking at the water with a new sense of wonder. Beneath the surface, there are foundations we didn't even know existed 20 years ago. You think about the boring process of data processing. Millions of points of light being turned into a map of a lost world. It's a very quiet, digital kind of magic. It's the sound of a mystery being solved one pixel at a time. But even with all our lasers and computers, the feeling of the place remains the same. The calm that the Khmer built into the earth is still there, vibrating at a frequency that our modern sensors are only just beginning to pick up. The humidity feels a bit lighter now, perhaps because the mystery has been partially cleared. You think about the people who lived in those laser-mapped houses. They didn't have LiDAR. They just had a shovel and a view of the sunset. They didn't know they were part of the most extensive urban complex in the pre-industrial world. They just knew that their lotus was blooming and their pond was full. There's a lesson in that, isn't there? We spend so much time looking at the big picture and the grand collapse, but life is mostly lived in the boring details of the backyard. The lasers gave us the map, but the water gives us the feeling. The boat enters a stretch of the Baray, where the water is so clear you can see the white sand on the bottom. It looks like a beach in the middle of the jungle. You realize that boring history is actually the most exciting kind, because it's the history of how things actually worked. It's not just about the wars, it's about the plumbing. It's not just about the kings, it's about the gardeners. You find yourself yawning, the sound echoing softly across the clear water. The high-tech hum of the helicopter has long since faded, replaced by the ancient, steady pulse of the crickets. You close your eyes and imagine the laser pulses hitting the ground around you. Ping, 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 measuring the distance between the now and the then. You are the connection point. You are the one drifting through the map, feeling the reality that the computers can only guess at. The water machine is no longer a mystery. It's a companion. It's a vast, silent friend that has been waiting under the trees for 500 years just for someone to notice its complexity. The boat slows down as it reaches a patch of lily pads. They look like green plates waiting for a feast that ended a long time ago. You feel a profound sense of closure. We've seen the rise, the peak, the struggle, and the rediscovery. The story is almost complete. You don't need to be a scientist or an archaeologist to appreciate the scale of it. You just need to be a dreamer in a boat. As you prepare for the final turn in the journey, you let the boring perfection of the LiDAR grid settle into your mind like a calming blueprint. The world is mapped, the city is found, and the water is still holding the moonlight, just as it always has. The boat has finally stopped its wandering, coming to rest against a soft, mossy bank where the water is so shallow it barely covers the white sand. You've reached the end of the line, both in time and in geography. The era of lasers and LiDAR fades into the background, leaving you with the raw, quiet reality of the present day. The West Baray is still here. The canals, though many are now just depressions in the forest floor, still dictate where the trees grow and where the rain pools. You step out of the boat for the last time, the cool water swirling around your ankles, feeling the boring weight of a millennium beneath your feet. The city of Angkor didn't really disappear. It just stopped trying so hard. It reached a state of equilibrium with the jungle, a final, stagnant reflection that is more peaceful than any empire could ever be. Imagine the absolute stillness of this place at 4 a.m. The master of flow is a ghost. The bronze Vishnu is a fragment of metal in a glass case, and the million people who once lived here are now part of the very soil you're standing on. You probably won't survive the sheer weight of the silence if you weren't already so close to sleep. It's a heavy, comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after a very long and very loud party has finally ended. The water in the Baray is no longer a machine or a cosmic ocean. It's just water. It's a home for fish, a bath for water buffalo, and a place for the moonlight to rest. A mainstream historical fact that brings us back to the present is that the Angkorian water system is actually being reactivated in small ways today. Modern engineers and UNESCO teams are studying the ancient dikes and canals to see how they can be used to manage contemporary floods and provide irrigation for the local farmers who still live among the ruins. The boring plumbing of the 11th century is actually more sustainable and efficient than many of the concrete solutions we've tried to build recently. It turns out the Khmer were green before it was a marketing slogan. They didn't just build a city. They built a legacy that still knows how to handle the rain better than we do. As you sit on the bank, watching the first hint of pre-dawn gray touch the horizon, you might see a small, modern-day fishing boat glide past. This leads us to a quirky tidbit of local life. The residents of the Angkor region still treat the Barays as sacred, but in a very practical way. They believe the Nikta, the spirits of the land and water, still live in the depths. Before a fisherman casts his net, he might offer a small prayer or a bit of tobacco to the water. It's a continuation of that spirit mirror idea we talked about earlier, but without the grand temples and the golden crowns. It's history reduced to its most basic human element, a hope for a good catch and a safe return. The boring debate about why Angkor fell seems less important now that you're sitting here in the quiet. Historians still argue about the exact combination of climate, war, and infrastructure failure, but maybe collapse is the wrong word. Perhaps it was just a migration of the soul. The civilization didn't die. It just grew tired of the grid. It traded the rigid geometry of the Barays for the messy, unpredictable freedom of the rivers further south. You're looking at the retirement home of a great power. There's a profound calm in knowing that even the most complex, stressed-out systems eventually get to stop working. They get to just be. You lean back into the tall grass, the blades cool and damp against your neck. The calm of Angkor has finally seeped into your own bones. You think about the boring persistence of the water. It has seen the rise of kings, the sweat of a million laborers, the roar of the megafloods, and the silent ping of the modern lasers. Through it all, it just stayed flat. It stayed patient. It waited for the noise to stop so it could show you the stars again. You find your own pulse slowing down, mirroring the imperceptible ripple of the reservoir. You're no longer a traveler or a student of history. You are just a part of the reflection. The humidity has finally broken, replaced by the crisp, cool air that comes just before the sun rises. You watch a single, white heron land on a submerged stone, its reflection perfectly still in the water. It looks like a statue, a modern version of the stone carvings on the Bayon. The boring history of the Barays is the most beautiful story you've ever heard, because it's a story about staying power. It's a story about a plan that was so good, the earth decided to keep it, even after the people who made it were gone. You close your eyes, the image of the silver water burned into your mind. You don't need to see the next section or hear the next fact. You've reached the center of the mandala. The master of flow has given his final command, and that command is to rest. The dikes are holding, the silt is settled, and the cosmic ocean is at peace. You are safe in the cradle of 1,000 years of stability. The world is quiet, the water is still, and the dream is finally, wonderfully, your own.